Once again, ideological lines were sharply drawn. Fighting for reform and drawing attention to incidents involving kidnapping were the Fundación Mirna Mac, a largely female human rights group that grew out of activism on behalf of civilians murdered by the army during the war, and Fundación Sobreviventes, the explicitly feminist group I was talking about at the beginning that struggled to draw attention first to femicide and then to the disappearance of children. Leading the fight for transnational adoption was a lawyers group, the Defenders of Adoption, and U.S. parents of adopted children from Guatemala, which pressured the U.S. State Department not to enforce international human rights treaties with respect to adoption, specifically the Hague Convention. This time, though, the Christian right was far less explicitly involved in 2008, although they provided many of the arguments that these more secular and even liberal adoption advocates used. One of these was that an earlier outspoken critic of human rights abuses and transnational adoption from Guatemala, Bruce Harris of Casa Alianza, was homosexual and hence self-evidently a child abuser. Thus, the culture wars sent overseas came back home to the U.S. in an extraordinarily compressed form, barely recognizable as such. It was probably a minority of the people taking up the arguments for adoption from Guatemala in 2008 that knew that they were using pathways worn by the Christian right, although their feminist and human rights-based opponents did know. But how well do we recognize in the U.S. how conservative adoption often has become? We know that since the 1970s, child relinquishment for adoption has become rare in the United States and very rare in Europe, because single mothers mostly raise their babies, unless they're very young or very Christian, or lose their children to the child welfare system. But that whole problem gets flattened out if the mothers in question are overseas. So U.S. adoptive parents of Guatemalan children imagine that kidnapping and human rights abuses don't happen, and the adoptable babies that cease to be available in the U.S. and Western Europe as soon as single mothers got any inkling that they could support their children somehow magically become available from overseas, where their mothers don't actually exist in people's imaginations. Instead, adoptive parents forums online and so forth imagine that even babies don't have parents. They're just sort of wandering the streets or languishing in orphanages. They write things like this from an adoption blog in 2007. Well, adoptions from Guatemala have been going on for 25 years, coming into existence during the brutal Civil War, when so many children were orphaned. There was little hope for these destitute children, and adoption was a viable option in a country that had nothing in place to accommodate these homeless children. Or, in this contemporary moment, we're debating in Congress something called the Families for Orphans Act, sponsored primarily by self-described feminist Elizabeth Bartolet, and a longtime advocate of easier adoptions. A bill that sounds really compelling until you realize that the orphans in the bill simply refers to children who are relinquished by mothers overseas, and that the purpose of the bill is to strip them of even the limited rights they have to register objections to the process under existing human rights treaties. So I've been arguing that transnational adoption is a site in a globalized culture war about gender, sexuality, and reproduction. But as you can gather, I also think it sheds light on political economy and the uneven ways that neoliberalism has been taken up. By focusing on the United States and Guatemala, I've picked two of the most acute examples. The story would be very different if I were talking about, say, Spain and China, which have much more bureaucratic state-sponsored adoption systems. But I think Guatemala and the U.S. are actually good examples of what the future of transnational adoption is going to look like, as long as the most effective political participants in it are the Christian right and would-be adoptive parents who want adoption to be easy. Although human rights treaties governing transnational adoption have historically been much more meaningful in EU countries, which for the most part do not permit private adoptions, Western European adopters are increasingly turning to non-Hague Convention countries like Ethiopia and Haiti, and have been for more than 5 years. The Netherlands also airlifted planes full of Haitian children to be adopted within hours of the earthquake. despite the fact that the agency involved had previously been accused of Haiti adoption fraud, and agonizing questions about whether these children had mothers who were looking for them. And make no mistake, the people who lose children are usually mothers. It's single mothers who are inclined to drop off their children at orphanages temporarily or permanently as part of a broader family survival strategy. I haven't talked much about orphanages because the transnational adoption system in Guatemala doesn't use them, but much of the rest of the world does. I also want to suggest that we've barely begun to think about what it means to say that transnationalism and multiracial families are the names of the work of the Christian right. The hard racism of the Palin-esque anti-immigrant Tea Party right does not begin to exhaust what we need to know about the US-based evangelical right. They've been in places like Guatemala since the 70s and 80s, and their influence is growing throughout Latin America and Christian Africa. Governor Ed Rendell did not get up the morning after the Haiti earthquake and decide he wanted to bring home a lot of Haitian kids. It was two white evangelical women from Pittsburgh who got on Facebook and told the story of their orphanage in Haiti in its dire straits after the earthquake. They mobilized their friends to demand action from politicians in Pennsylvania and ultimately the Obama administration. I hope I've suggested that the Christian right is exactly who we think they are in terms of their politics about gender reproduction and family. They're trying to ensure that children are raised with two parents, a mother and a father who are not homosexual, but they are altogether something else on questions of race and racially mixed families. The Keystone Center of Life Church, the group that sponsored the Pennsylvania Haiti orphans, is an evangelical covenant church, which describes itself as, quote, a rapidly growing multi-ethnic denomination. This is far truer of the evangelical churches than the liberal mainline churches, that they're multi-ethnic. When folks on the left complain that their racial justice movements were transformed into liberal multiculturalism, we're only beginning to get at the problem. The interesting story is not what liberals did with racial justice movements did. It's what conservatives did. Just as vast swaths of corporate America are more racially diverse than much of academia, so too are evangelical Christian right denominations more integrated than liberal Protestant churches. So finally, I want to leave you with three thoughts. If we want to think transnationally, we need to take religion seriously, because religious groups are among the most transnational of institutions. Second, we have to think about family, gender, and sexuality, because these have become the basic grammar of religious conservatives. And then finally, the corollary is this. If we want to understand sexuality, gender, and family politics in the United States, we need these other two pieces. Religion, which we often do notice as part of the picture, and also the specific ways that feminist and anti-feminist culture wars are playing out transnationally, which we often miss. Thank you.